We are the Kaelthari. We have been at war for give or take a few centuries, 840 years. We have conquered 47 civilizations, 47. We have broken species that breathed methane, species that saw in spectrums we cannot name, species that communicated through vibrations in solid rock. We have crushed them all, methodically, precisely, with the kind of calm, surgical efficiency that makes lesser empires weep into their nutrient solutions and beg for mercy. We do not lose wars. I need you to hold that thought very carefully. Please. Because what I am about to describe, what I am about to commit to official record, is the single most humiliating, confounding, jaw-dropping, scale-shaking series of events in the history of the Kaelthari Empire, and I was there for all of it. Every excruciating moment. And if I am being fully honest, part of me wishes I had called in sick that week. Let me set the scene. The third planet of the Sol system. Mostly water. One moon which the locals apparently find very romantic, for reasons that are their business entirely. The dominant species calls themselves humans, which, when translated into Kaelthari, roughly means the ones who are here. Not the chosen, not the supreme, not even the strong, just the ones who are here. That alone should have told us something. A species so unbothered by the cosmos that they named themselves after the simple fact of existing, we should have turned the fleet around right then, but we did not. Because the pre-invasion survey team had given High Consul Azip a report that made the whole planet sound like a pleasant afternoon exercise. Battle scribe Laura and I had read that report together in the officers' mess over our evening ration of compressed protein and mild hallucinogenic tea. I remember Laura reading aloud from it, her secondary eyelids half closed with amusement. "Listen to this," she had said, tapping the data slate. Quote, "Humans display aggressive tribal behavior, limited spacefaring capability, significant internal conflict with one another, no unified planetary defense, and a recorded history of solving disputes through prolonged bloody violence. Recommendation: Standard Conquest Protocol. Estimated full pacification window, 14 to 20 standard cycles." She had looked at me over the top of the slate. 14 to 20 cycles, she repeated, for a pre-unified species with no shields and no fleet. I had nodded. Generous estimate. She had laughed. Actually laughed. We are both so sorry about that laugh. In retrospect, it haunts me. You see, the survey team had done what survey teams always do. They had measured everything they could see. They had counted weapons, rated technology, mapped fortifications, catalogued known military forces, assessed strategic resources. They had built a complete picture of human warfare from a mathematical standpoint. What they had entirely failed to measure, because there is genuinely no instrument in the Kaelthari scientific catalog that can quantify it, was what humans feel when someone threatens to take their home. We were about to find out. The very hard way. The fleet made orbit on what humans call a Tuesday. I do not know why Tuesday specifically seemed to be the correct day for our arrival. It simply was. High Consul Azip had chosen the approach window based on gravitational tides and fuel efficiency. Humans, had they known, might have preferred we arrived on a Friday. Or perhaps not at all, but Tuesday it was. 230 warships, the Kaelthari Third Conquest Fleet, the finest, most decorated fighting force in the Empire, ships that had cracked the orbital defenses of the Veth Confederacy in 6 hours, ships that had broken the legendary iron lattice shields of the Dorian Ascendancy in a single day, ships carrying 40,000 soldiers, each one trained, conditioned and optimized for coordinated tactical engagement. We held formation in low orbit, inside the detection threshold of their primitive sensor arrays, and we watched. The planet beneath us was loud, not just in the sonic sense, although it was that too. Their radio frequencies were absolutely screaming with signals. Music, mostly. An absurd, constant flood of music in 1,000 different formats. I had a communications officer, young sub-technician Phil, who made the mistake of trying to monitor human broadcasts to assess military chatter, and he ended up listening to something called classic rock for 6 hours before anyone noticed he had gone very still and was humming. Azip had ordered him to stop immediately. He stopped, but he kept humming, very quietly. I mention Phil because he is weirdly important later. For the first 3 days we observed standard protocol, map the population centers, identify command structures, locate military installations, establish the target priority list. Laura ran the analysis models. I reviewed the outputs. Azip held his long, elegant hands behind his back and stared down at the blue-white sphere below us with the expression he always wore before a conquest. the expression of someone about to solve a fairly interesting puzzle. They have several large land-based military bases, Laura reported on day 2, her voice as calm as a data stream. Most significant concentrations here, here, and here. She highlighted 3 points on the holographic globe. Their nuclear arsenal is distributed across 17 known sites. We recommend targeting those first, simultaneously, to neutralize escalation risk. After that, atmospheric suppression on major population centers, followed by ground insertion at the capital cities. Azip studied the globe. Confirmed casualties if we take the nuclear sites first, he asked. Approximately 400,000 humans by our best projection, Laura said, with the same tone one might use to report a slightly disappointing weather forecast. Acceptable, Azip said. Proceed to Phase 1 staging. I wrote it all down in my historian's log. Neat. Orderly. The conquest of Earth. Day 3. Everything going exactly according to plan. O Vortak, you sweet, oblivious fool. Phase 1 began at what humans call 0300 hours, local time, on a Wednesday. The thinking was elegant, as Kaelthari thinking always is. Strike in the darkest part of their night cycle. Hit the nuclear facilities first, simultaneously, to remove any chance of escalation. Then begin atmospheric suppression over the 7 largest human cities to suppress communication and movement. Then land the ground forces and begin the process of establishing control nodes at government centers. Clean, methodical, calculated. We fired the first strike from orbit. Precision kinetic impactors. No heat signature, no warning. 17 targets, all hit within a margin of error of 0.003 seconds. The nuclear sites were gone before a single human alarm had the chance to sound. And then something happened that was not in the survey report. Every single human on the planet woke up. Not literally, of course. Not all of them. But within 18 minutes of those strikes, every human military installation on the planet had shifted to maximum alert status. Within 30 minutes, every human government had declared a state of war, not just with us, but with the concept of what had just happened. Within 45 minutes, the human military frequencies that Laura had been monitoring went from organized to what she described, in her notes, as operationally frantic in a manner we have not previously encountered. They are scared, Subcommander Thriel said, from his station at the tactical board. He was a solid officer. Thriel, reliable, experienced. He had overseen ground operations on 11 conquered worlds. He said it with complete confidence. The strikes destabilized their command response. They are panicking. I was not sure. I had been watching the frequency data, and there was something in the pattern that my instinct and Kaelthari are not supposed to rely on instinct flagged as wrong. Scared species go quiet. Scared species hide. Scared species try to negotiate, or run, or collapse inward. Humans went louder. The human frequencies did not quiet down. They got faster, denser, more urgent, not with the sound of panic, but with the sound of something coordinating at a speed that should not have been possible without pre-established protocols. They were not reacting to a plan. They were building one in real time. Consul Azip, I said carefully, I would like to recommend we hold Phase 2 for a full analysis of their response pattern before proceeding. Azip turned his pale yellow eyes to me. They were not unkind, those eyes. He was not a cruel commander. He was simply utterly certain. He had been doing this for over 3 centuries. He had never been wrong before. Vorian, he said pleasantly, what are they going to do? Fly up here? He gestured at the viewport, at the vast empty space around us, at the fleet still and powerful and immovable in orbit. I looked at the viewport. I looked at the frequency data. I looked back at the viewport. Write down the time, I told Laura, quietly. She frowned at me. Why? For the record, I said, just write down the time. They flew up, not immediately, and not in a way that should have worked. The humans had, at that point, a small collection of spacecraft, mostly scientific vessels, a handful of military orbital platforms, which our survey had flagged as low threat, and which were never designed to engage a full Kaelthari conquest fleet. Their planet had no unified space force. They had not finished building one yet. They had arguments about the budget for it, which Laura had found briefly entertaining when she reviewed the intercepts. What they did have was every pilot on the planet who had ever flown anything at any speed in any direction, being handed a vehicle and a target and approximately 40 minutes of briefing. The first human craft appeared on our sensors at 0547 hours. Then 12 more. Then 40. Then 93. They were not warships. They were orbital shuttles, cargo haulers, 3 decommissioned scientific survey ships, something that our sensor team initially misidentified as a weather monitoring satellite before it turned and burned directly toward the fleet at maximum thrust. 3 laughed when the data came in. He actually laughed. "They are sending civilian transports at us," he said. "They have repurposed agricultural supply ships. I am reading one vessel that our system is cataloging as and I want to be precise here, as a mobile fish processing platform." The room laughed. Even I smiled. It was objectively absurd. And then the fish processing platform, retrofitted with 2 magnetic rail drivers that the humans had apparently stripped from a coastal defense installation and welded directly onto the hull in what our engineers would later, in a tone of horrified admiration, describe as technically impossible but somehow functional, opened fire on the lead destroyer of the Kaelthari Third Fleet. It did not destroy the destroyer. The shots hit the forward shield matrix and dissipated. The platform was vaporized 16 seconds later. But it had fired. A fish processing platform had fired on a Kaelthari destroyer. I wrote it down in the log. I wrote every detail, not because I thought it was strategically significant, but because I had a feeling already building in the lower registers of my thorax that I was watching the opening of something I did not have a category for yet. The attack wave lasted 4 hours. That is not how these things are supposed to go. When a pre-spacefaring civilization fires on a conquest fleet, they fire once, they realize the futility, and they stop, they plead, they negotiate, they submit. That is the pattern. That is the data from 47 previous conquests, confirmed again and again across every species we have ever encountered. The humans fired for 4 hours. They lost ships constantly. Every pass they made, our point defense systems shredded their makeshift fleet. They had nothing that could penetrate our shields at any meaningful depth. They were sending people to die in tin cans welded together in less than 40 minutes against the finest military hardware the Kaelthari Empire had produced in 8 centuries of continuous refinement. And they kept coming. More launched from the surface as the first waves were destroyed. We watched the launches on our sensor grid. Launch after launch after launch. Different shapes, different sizes, different improvised weapon systems. One craft had been loaded with what our sensor team, after considerable confused debate, determined was a significant quantity of a human chemical explosive compound, and the pilot had aimed it at a troop carrier and burned the thrusters to full and did not eject. 3 stopped laughing after the 2nd hour. Laura stopped writing her casualty projections after the 3rd because the numbers were not fitting her models, and the models kept needing to be revised in a direction she did not like. Azip watched in silence. His hands were still clasped behind his back, but they were no longer relaxed. At the 4-hour mark, a human voice came across the hailing frequency, clear, steady, in a translation that our linguistic system produced with a slight delay, because the human was speaking extremely fast. Kaelthari Fleet. This is Admiral Holt of the Earth Unified Defense Command, speaking for the people of this planet. You have fired on our world. You have killed our people. You want this planet. Come down and take it, because we are not going anywhere, not one of us. And you are going to find out very soon that there is a very large difference between fighting a species that wants to survive and fighting a species that has decided it does not mind dying. Silence on the bridge. Then sub-technician Phil, who had been very quietly humming something in the background for the past 4 hours, stopped humming and said, softly, "That woman sounds serious. She is reading from a script." Thriel said immediately, "It is bravado. Psychological warfare. We have seen this pattern before." "We have not seen this pattern before," I said. Everyone looked at me. "What we have seen before," I said, choosing my words with the care of someone who is aware they are about to say something that the room does not want to hear, is a species making noise before they submit. What I am observing in this case is a species making noise because they genuinely mean it. There is a difference. The frequency of their military communications has not decreased since the attack began. Their launch rate from the surface has not decreased. Their command structure has not fragmented. They are, by every metric I am watching, accelerating. They are getting faster and more organized as we engage them, not slower. "It will break," Thriel said, firmly. "They are biological. They have fear responses. It will break." I looked at Thriel. Then I looked at Azip. Azip said nothing. He was still watching the viewport. But his hands, I noticed, had unclenched from behind his back, and one of them had come up to press, very slightly against the side of his jaw. It was the only tell he had. the only sign that something had gotten past his certainty. I wrote it down. Phase 2 began at 1100 hours. Ground insertion. 2,000 Kaelthari soldiers. In the first wave, full combat armor, energy weapons, tactical air support from atmospheric fighters. They landed at 4 coordinates simultaneously, all within 50 kilometers of major human population centers as per the established playbook. The landing itself was clean. The landing zones had been selected by our survey drones, open terrain, low civilian density, good sight lines in all directions. The first wave secured the perimeter in 12 minutes. Exactly 12 minutes. Thriel was pleased, secured the perimeter in 12 minutes. Exactly 12 minutes. He pointed at the tactical display with the calm satisfaction of a professional watching a trained routine execute without a single error. 12 minutes, he said, standard deviation of 0.4 from projected. This is textbook. I was watching a different part of the display. Thriel, I said. What is that? I pointed at a small cluster of signals about 8 kilometers north of landing zone 2. They had appeared on the sensor grid 2 minutes after touchdown. They were not moving fast. They were not moving in formation. They were moving in a scattered, disorganized pattern through what our topographical data identified as heavy woodland terrain. Civilians, Thriel said without looking. Refugees, most likely. Fleeing the area. Standard displacement pattern. They are moving toward the landing zone, I said. Thriel looked up. The cluster was indeed moving toward landing zone 2, slowly, through dense trees, spread wide apart, spread in a way that was the exact opposite of how a group of frightened civilians moves together. A frightened civilian cluster compresses. These signals were spreading out, spacing themselves. Deliberately. That is not a refugee pattern, I said. 3 had already opened the channel to the ground commander at LZ2. Subcommander Rael, be advised, we are tracking a potential contact signature north of your position, approximately 8 kilometers, moving in your direction, possibly armed. Recommend heightened perimeter watch. Subcommander Rael's voice came back crisp and calm. Confirmed, sir. We are tracking it. Likely nothing. Terrain provides significant cover for sensor distortion. We have the perimeter locked. Nothing is getting through this position without us seeing it, at least 300 meters out. Understood, Thriel said, and looked back at the main tactical display with satisfaction. I kept watching the cluster. It stopped. For 11 minutes it stopped completely. Went so still that Laura flagged it as a possible sensor phantom and made a note to recalibrate. And then it moved again. All at once. And it was not 8 kilometers north of LZ2 anymore. It was 4 kilometers. It had cut the distance in half while appearing motionless on our sensors. Because the signals we had been tracking had moved, while leaving behind static emitters disguised as their sensor signatures to hold our attention on the wrong location. They had played a trick, on Kaelthari sensors, with field-improvised equipment, on a species that our survey had rated as limited tactical sophistication. I did not say anything, I just pointed at the display. Thriel saw it. He got to the channel in under a second. Rao, revised contact, 4 kilometers north. They have been moving under sensor cover. Treat as hostile. Respond immediately. The channel exploded into sound. Not the sound of an engagement. Not the sharp, organized exchange of energy fire that we hear when 2 trained military forces meet each other. Something louder, more irregular. The sound of an environment being entirely, violently, and without any adherence to tactical predictability, turned upside down. The first words we understood clearly from Rao were, perimeter down. They are in the wire. They are already inside the contact. Contact, contact. Then his signal broke into fragments, overlapping voices, screaming, not in fear, in coordination. Human voices screaming things to each other in the middle of a firefight. Short, sharp, specific things that our translation system scrambled to keep up with, but which the tone conveyed perfectly clearly even without translation. Move, cover, flank, go, now. 3 was standing now, both hands on the edge of the tactical console. Every line of his body had gone rigid. The LZ2 signal cluster was fragmenting, Kaelthari's soldier identifiers going dark. Not all at once, one by one, in a rolling pattern that moved from the northern perimeter inward, which meant the human assault was not a frontal push, it was a penetration. It was already behind the front line and moving deeper, and the soldiers at the front did not know yet, because the ones behind them had already been silenced. How? Thriel said. He was not asking anyone specifically. He was asking the universe. He was asking the display. He was asking the data, as if the data might have a reasonable explanation to offer. How are they doing this? They know the terrain. I said. We do not. We saw the woodland as cover for us. They saw it as their ground. They have been training on that ground, or ground exactly like it, their entire lives. Every animal they ever hunted, every threat they ever tracked, they learned to move through terrain like that before they could read or write. We sat in orbit for 3 days studying their military installations. They spent 3 days studying us. They watched our drones. They mapped our sensor intervals. They found the gap. Laura was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. It was not quite fear. It was closer to the look one gets when the math produces an answer that is technically correct but feels deeply personally offensive. Vorin, she said, their ground assault force at LZ-2 is projecting at approximately 400 individuals. Yes, I said. We landed 2,000 soldiers at LZ-2. Yes, I said. With full armor, air support, and fortified perimeter positions. Yes, I said. She looked at the display, at the identifier signals going dark, one by one. Who, she said slowly, are these people? Their name, I would learn over the following hours, was the 9th Mountain Strike Group, a human military formation that operated specifically in dense terrain environments. They were led by a human whose name our translation system rendered as Sergeant Dax Roran, which, in the Kaelthari military database, I had to create a new file category for because nothing in our existing system covered the kind of engagement data we were seeing. He was not the highest-ranked human soldier we would encounter. He was not the one who commanded from the rear and planned the campaign. He was a ground soldier, a man who had spent 17 years learning to move through wild terrain, learning to fight close, learning to do things with a human body in natural environments that our combat models did not have parameters for. Kaelthari soldiers are extraordinarily trained. They are conditioned, augmented, disciplined, and optimized. They fight together, in formation, with precision timing, using systems of overlapping coverage that have defeated every opponent we have faced. They are by every objective measure superior individual combatants to any species we have previously encountered. They had never fought Dax Roran. The LZ-2 transmission logs, reconstructed afterward from partial recordings and survivor accounts, contain a sequence that I included in full in the official record, because I believe future Kaelthari military planners need to understand exactly what happened, not the strategic summary. The actual sequence. The 9th Mountain entered the perimeter from 3 sides simultaneously, not 2 as standard doctrine would suggest, 3, using the 3rd approach vector because it required moving through a section of terrain that the survey data had flagged as impassable due to a steep ridge line, and which the 9th Mountain had apparently considered passable because they had looked at it with their own eyes and decided that the survey was wrong. Roran's team came over the ridge, in darkness, silently, with equipment that was by our technical standard primitive, but which was lightweight enough to carry over terrain that our soldiers with their heavier armor had not been designed to traverse. They did not engage at distance where our armor and energy weapons would have been decisive. They came in close, extremely close. Close enough that the targeting systems on Kaelthari combat armor, optimized for engagement at 200 meters and above, lost efficiency because the humans were inside the minimum calculation threshold. They were not supposed to be that close. Nothing was supposed to get that close. Nothing was supposed to get that close. But they were there. And once they were there, they were very, very difficult to stop, because a Kaelthari soldier in full combat armor, in a fortified position, is essentially invulnerable at range, but at close quarters, in confusion, in darkness, in terrain that turns every 3 meters into a new decision point, the invulnerability becomes considerably more complicated. Laura summarized it in 3 words, in her official report. I remember reading those 3 words and feeling something I can only describe as an entirely new form of professional respect crossed with existential concern. She wrote, they adapted faster. LZ-2 fell after 3 hours and 40 minutes of continuous engagement. The official loss numbers at LZ-2 were 1,212 Kaelthari soldiers killed or incapacitated, approximately 80 taken prisoner, which we discovered later because the humans had apparently decided to take prisoners instead of simply continuing, a decision that at the time baffled Thriel completely. Why would they spare them? He asked. They are not savage, I said. That is the entire point that everyone keeps missing. The human losses at LZ-2, as best as we could reconstruct, were around 140, from a force of 400, against 2,000 armored Kaelthari soldiers, with air support. 3 stared at the numbers for a very long time. Then he sat down, which he had not done once in the previous 16 hours. Consul Azip, I said, turning to the High Consul. With respect, I need to formally request a halt to ground insertion operations pending a full tactical reassessment. What we are seeing at LZ-2 is not an anomaly, it is a pattern, and if we continue inserting troops without understanding what we are actually dealing with, we will lose soldiers faster than we can replace them. Azip looked at me, then at the display, then at the tactical board where LZ-1 and LZ-3 were now also showing unexpected resistance pressure, not as severe as LZ-2 but trending in the wrong direction, trending toward more organization and more aggression and more of that specific quality that I still did not have the right Kaelthari word for. What would you call it? Azip asked me, quietly, not dismissively, genuinely. He was asking the historian, because the tactician, the conqueror, the 3-century veteran of 47 wars, was standing in front of a data set that his experience did not cover, and he needed a different kind of mind. I thought about the attack wave, the fish processing platform, Admiral Holt's transmission, the 9th mountain going over the impassable ridge, Sergeant Roran and 400 soldiers walking into 2,000 armored troops and coming out the other side with a better ratio than our models had said was physically achievable. I would call it, I said, slowly, a species that has been at war with itself continuously for its entire recorded history, a species that has never, not once in all of its existence, actually been at peace long enough to forget how to fight, a species that does not experience warfare as a state they enter. They experience it as a state they return to. And every single time they have returned to it, they have been forced to learn faster, adapt faster, and hit harder than the last time, because the thing they were fighting had gotten better too. I let that sit in the air of the bridge for a moment. We have spent 800 years fighting civilizations that did not want war, I continued. That is our experience base, 47 species who were trying to survive an encounter with the Kaelthari Empire. What we have encountered here, Consul, for the first time in our empire's history, is a species that is genuinely functionally comfortable with war, not because they are animals, not because they lack intelligence, but because they have had 8,000 years of practice, and they have had to earn every single decade of their survival by fighting for it, and they have never, not once, had the luxury of forgetting what it costs to stop fighting. Silence. From everyone. Even Feel had stopped humming. Azip stood very still. The hand that had come up to press against his jaw was there again, pressing harder this time. You are saying, he said, carefully, that we did not invade a planet. No, sir, I said. What did we invade? I looked at the display, at the 4 landing zones, each one under pressure, each one fighting not the way conquered species fight, with desperation and collapse, but with the controlled, escalating, impossibly stubborn fury of a species that had been preparing for exactly this moment, not because they had known we were coming, but because they had been preparing for something like us their entire lives, because their entire history had taught them that something like us was always, eventually, coming. I believe, sir, I said, that we have invaded a very large, extremely well-practiced training ground. I paused, and I think we should very seriously reconsider our options before Phase 3. I looked at Azip. He looked at me. He looked at the display. And for the first time in 3 centuries of commanding conquests, the look on his face was not certainty. I would like to end Part 1 of this record here, not because the day was over, because it was not, but because what happened next required its own section of the official archive, its own careful documentation, and a significant amount of Kaelthari military tradition to be revised before anyone would believe it. But I want to note for the record that at 18:23 hours on that Wednesday, Consul Azip ordered a full halt to ground operations. For the first time in 840 years of continuous Kaelthari conquest, we stopped. Not because we had been defeated. We had not been defeated. We were still in orbit, still in control of the high ground, still numerically superior by a significant margin. We stopped because I had convinced Azip, for the first time in his career, that we were not fighting a situation we understood. And the most terrifying part, I wrote in my log that evening, was not that the humans had hurt us. It was that they knew it. Because at our 10:31 hours, 8 minutes after the halt order, a new transmission came across the hailing frequency. Calm. Not triumphant. Not angry. Not desperate. Calm. The way a person is calm when they are settled, when they are in their ground, when they have been doing this their whole lives, and they are not tired yet and they are prepared to keep going for as long as it takes. A different voice this time. Not Admiral Holt. A ground voice. Rougher. Quieter. Someone whose calmness was not the calmness of rank and command, but the calmness of someone who had just come out of 4 hours of close combat and was, technically, fine. Hey, the voice said. Just that. Just hey. Then we can do this for a while, can you? The channel closed. Laura stared at the silent speaker. Who was that? She asked. I looked at the signal origin data. Best I can trace it, I said. It originated from somewhere in the LZ2 perimeter, from inside what used to be our fortified position. She stared at me. Sergeant Roran, I said, with what I admit was a certain grim admiration. I believe. I closed my log entry for the day. Then I opened it again and added one final line. We have made a mistake, I wrote. The question is no longer whether we miscalculated. The question is whether we are capable of surviving long enough to understand exactly what kind of mistake this is. I saved the file. Outside the viewport, the blue-white planet turned slowly in the dark, patient and enormous, while down on its surface, in the smoke and the tree line and the ruined perimeter of what used to be our foothold, a species that had never, not once in its entire history, figured out how to stay out of a fight, was getting ready for tomorrow. And tomorrow I already knew was going to be so much worse. I did not sleep that night. Kaelthari physiology technically requires a rest cycle of approximately 4 hours every 32. I sat at my station for the full 32 and skipped the 4 entirely. This is not something I recommend. By hour 28, the edges of the tactical display were starting to look slightly warm, which is a neurological symptom, not a lighting issue, and Laura kept glancing at me the way one glances at a piece of equipment that might be developing a fault. But I could not stop watching. Because while the fleet held position in orbit, and while Consul Azip reviewed options with his senior commanders in the war room, and while Thriel paced a groove into the deck plating outside the tactical bay, the humans on the surface did not pause, not for a moment, not for a single solitary moment. They used our halt. They used every second of it. The sensor network gave us a picture of the surface that, over those overnight hours, transformed from something we had mapped and catalogued into something we barely recognized. Every major road network within 50 kilometers of the 4 landing zones showed movement, not civilian movement, military movement, organized, purposeful, and operating with a complete disregard for the fact that we were watching from orbit and could see every vehicle, every column, every repositioning event. They know we can see them, Laura said, at around 0200 hours, staring at the sensor feed with her head tilted slightly to one side, the way she tilted it when data was refusing to make sense by conventional means. Yes, I said, and they are not trying to hide. No. Why? She said, would a ground force move in full view of an orbital fleet that can target them with precision kinetic strikes at any moment? I thought about it. I thought about everything I had watched over the previous 18 hours. The fish processing platform. The ridge the survey had called impassable. The way the 9th Mountain had used our sensor intervals against us. The transmission from Roran. The calm in that voice. Because, I said slowly, they want us to see it. They want us to know how many of them are moving. They want us to look at the scale of what is repositioning on that surface and factor it into whatever decision Azip is building right now. Laura was quiet for a moment. That is a psychological operation, she said. Yes. Against an orbital fleet. Yes. Using themselves as the instrument. Yes. She sat back in her chair. She pressed the tips of 2 of her 4 fingers against the center of her forehead, which for Laura was the equivalent of someone else throwing a data slate across the room. They are not a pre-unified species, she said. Whatever the survey team wrote, they were wrong. These are not separate nations operating in parallel. Those ground forces are from a minimum of 14 different human national militaries, by the uniform recognition data alone, and they are moving in coordinated patterns that require a shared command architecture. They built a unified command structure in under 24 hours. 18, I said, checking my log. The first coordinated cross-national movement pattern appeared at approximately 18 hours after our initial strike. Laura stared at me. 18 hours, she repeated. It took us 4 years of negotiation and treaty drafting to achieve coordinated interfleet command protocols during the Veth campaign. Yes, I said. How? I leaned back in my own chair. I looked at the ceiling of the bridge. It was a perfectly functional, well-maintained ceiling. It had nothing useful to offer, but I looked at it anyway, because sometimes you need somewhere to direct the weight of a thought that is too heavy to hold entirely behind your own eyes. Laura, I said, how many wars have humans fought against other humans by our historical record assessment? She pulled up the data. Survey team estimated over 14,000 distinct recorded armed conflicts in their documented history, with the actual number likely significantly higher due to unrecorded prehistoric periods. 14,000 conflicts, I said, against each other. against people who speak different languages, who think differently, who organize differently, who fight differently. 14,000 times, humans have had to figure out, under pressure, how to understand an enemy they did not fully know and beat them anyway. I looked back down from the ceiling, and now we have given them a common enemy, one target, one direction to point all of that experience. We have done what 14,000 wars could not do. We have unified them. Laura sat very still. We did that, she said quietly. We did that, I confirmed. On day one, with our very first strike. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she picked up her data slate and began rewriting her tactical models from the first line. All of them, the ones she had built over 3 years preparing for this campaign. She threw out every assumption about fragmented human response and started over. And she worked through the rest of the night without stopping, and I watched her work, and I thought about how even Laura, who was the sharpest analytical mind in the Third Fleet, had not been prepared for this. Because there was nothing in our existing reference library that could have prepared her, or any of us. Azip called a senior staff meeting at 0600 hours. The war room was cold in the way that rooms get cold when the people inside them are carefully not saying what they are thinking. I was there. Thriel was there, looking like a soldier who had spent the night fighting his own certainty and losing. 2 fleet admirals, Gorish and Palevor, both with campaign records longer than most civilizations' entire military histories. Chief Weapons Officer San, who had overseen orbital engagements on 16 conquered worlds and had a reputation for being professionally, almost serenely, unmoved by combat data. San was not serene. San was sitting with both sets of hands folded on the table and the expression of someone doing sustained active work to maintain composure. Azip stood at the head of the table. He had the overnight summary in front of him. He had read it. Every line of it. I could tell because he had the specific, particular stillness of someone who has received information that has reorganized something fundamental inside them and who has not yet decided what to build in the space where the old structure used to stand. Laura, he said. New projections. Laura stood. She had been working all night and she looked it. But her voice was steady. Her voice was always steady. It was one of the things I admired most about her, based on revised assessment of human military coordination and the observed repositioning overnight. She said, we now estimate that the 4 landing zones are facing combined ground opposition of approximately 140,000 soldiers, with further reinforcement columns still moving. This figure does not include civilian participation, which our sensors are detecting in what I will describe as a strategically significant volume. Civilian participation, Gorish said. Define. Human civilians, Laura said with careful precision, have been observed delivering supplies, medical support, communication relay equipment, and in several documented instances, improvised weapon systems and ammunition directly to military positions. They are not combatants in the conventional sense, but they are functioning as a logistics and support layer that is, effectively, extending the military's operational capacity beyond what its formal supply chains would support. Gorish blinked. He had 4 eyes and he blinked all of them, which was a significant tell for someone as experienced as he was. The civilian population, he said, is voluntarily supporting military operations in an active combat zone. Yes, against us. Against us, Laura confirmed. All of them? Laura looked at her data slate. Our best current estimate is approximately 94% of the human population within range of our landing zones, with coordination extending to population centers well beyond that range in a support role. The 3% who have not actively supported military or civilian logistics operations are, primarily, the very young, the very old, and the medically incapacitated. Even within that 3%, our sensors have detected what appear to be organized civilian communication networks maintaining information relay functions. The room absorbed this. I watched Saturn unfold and refold her hands. Once, precisely. The planet, Sanon said. She said it as a complete sentence. Just those 2 words, and then a pause, and then the entire planet is fighting us. Yes, I said, because someone had to say it cleanly. Azip looked at me. Options Vorian. I had prepared for this question. I had been preparing for it since approximately 0200 hours, when the weight of what I was watching had fully settled into something I could name. I took a breath. Option 1, I said. Orbital bombardment. Broad spectrum. We can neutralize the ground threat completely from up here. We have the capability. We have done it before. Silence. Option 2, I continued. We withdraw from the surface entirely, consolidate in orbit, and open formal negotiation. We acknowledge that Phase 1 and Phase 2 have not produced the expected outcome, and we approach this as a diplomatic situation rather than a military one. More silence. A different kind of silence. Option 3, I said, we continue the ground campaign with a revised tactical doctrine, significantly increased troop numbers, and a complete recalibration of our engagement parameters to account for what we are actually facing instead of what the survey told us we would face. Azip looked at me steadily. And your recommendation? I had thought about this for 6 hours. I had run it through every framework I had, every historical parallel, every campaign record, every piece of data from the previous 24 hours. Option 2, I said, with a caveat. The caveat, Azip said. The caveat, I said, is that we are not negotiating from a position of strength, and they know it. They know it because a species that has fought 14,000 wars against itself can read a battlefield situation with a precision that we have consistently underestimated. They know we halted. They know why we halted. They have spent all night repositioning to make sure that if we resume ground operations, our situation will be measurably worse than it was yesterday. I looked around the table. If we negotiate, I said, we should be honest about what we are doing. We are not magnanimously offering peace to a defeated enemy. We are acknowledging that we initiated a conflict we did not understand, against a species we did not correctly evaluate, and that continuing it as planned will cost us more than this planet is worth. The room was very quiet. Admiral Kaelthari, who had said nothing since the meeting began, spoke for the first time. He was old. Kaelthari, old even by Kaelthari standards. He had fought in campaigns that were historical records when the rest of us were cadets. His voice, when it came, was slow and weighted, not with age, but with the specific gravity of someone choosing words that will matter. In 840 years, he said, we have never negotiated. No, I said, we have not. The Empire will not receive this well. No, I said, it will not. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the data on the table. Then he looked at Azip. The historian is right, he said. That was all. Azip was quiet for 30 seconds. I counted them. I was writing in my log the whole time because I knew that this 30 seconds was going to be in history books somewhere, somehow, for a very long time. Then he said, open the hailing frequency to Admiral Holt. The conversation between Consul Azip and Admiral Holt lasted 1 hour and 14 minutes. I transcribed all of it, every word. It is the longest diplomatic exchange in Kaelthari history with a species we had engaged militarily. It is also, by a significant margin, the most unusual. Holt came on the channel without ceremony. No titles, no formal opening. Just her voice, direct and level, carrying the specific quality of authority that does not come from rank but from demonstrated capacity. Consul Azip, she said, I was wondering when you would call. Azip, to his enormous credit, did not flinch at that. Admiral Holt, he said, I am calling to discuss terms. A pause. Not a long one. Terms for what, exactly? For ending active engagement, Azip said. Another pause. Slightly longer. You want to stop? I am proposing we stop, Azip said, carefully. There is a difference, Holt said. She said it the same way I had said something very similar to Thriel the day before about the difference between scared noise and genuine intention. She said it without heat, without victory in her voice, with a simple factual precision that was more unnerving than any amount of hostility would have been. You want to stop because continuing is going to cost you something you do not want to pay, and I respect that you are honest enough to call and say it, instead of sending a drone with a white flag. A breath. So terms. Azip laid out his initial position. Return of Kaelthari prisoners. Withdrawal from the surface. Formal cessation of hostilities. In exchange, the Kaelthari fleet would withdraw from the Sol system entirely and would not return. Holt listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she stores. The prisoners are not a negotiating point. We are returning them regardless. That is not something we trade. Those are people. Thrilik, standing behind me, made a very small sound that might have been the beginning of a comment. I put my hand on his arm without turning around. He stopped. The withdrawal, Holt continued, I want in writing, a formal document. Binding, in a format that your empire's legal system recognizes as enforceable, which means I will need to involve people from my side who understand interstellar treaty law, and since we did not previously know interstellar treaty law existed, that is going to take a few days to organize. Understood, Azip said. And Holt said, I want a full disclosure of how you found us. Survey records, approach data, whatever intelligence your people collected on our planet. Not because I want to use it against you, because I want to understand what we looked like to you before you came, and I want to make sure that whatever made us look like a viable target is something we address before the next species in your neighborhood decides to do their own survey. There was a pause from Azip's side. I was writing very fast. That is an unusual request, Azip said. We are an unusual species, Holt said. And there was something in that, something in the way she said it, that was not arrogance and was not pride but was something that sat between the two, something earned, something that had been paid for in the previous 24 hours by everyone who had gotten into a spacecraft made of welded salvage and pointed it at an alien fleet, and everyone who had gone over an impassable ridge in the dark, and everyone who had driven supply trucks through a combat zone because their neighbors needed ammunition. Agreed, Azip said. The conversation continued. Logistics, timelines, points of contact, the mechanics of undoing what we had started. Laura was already building the withdrawal sequencing model by the time the channel closed. I sat in my chair and stared at the speaker for a moment after the channel closed. Then I turned back to my log and added a note. Ren Holt, I wrote. Rank, Admiral, species human. Notable did not gloat. This may be the most surprising thing I have recorded in this entire file. The prisoner return happened first, because Holt had said it would, and Holt, I was learning, did what she said she would do. 80 Kaelthari soldiers taken at LZ-2 and the other landing zones were transported to a neutral point between the surface and our lowest orbital position. They arrived in a human craft, a proper one, not a converted fish processor, an actual military transport, which our docking systems accepted after a brief and slightly awkward technical negotiation between our chief engineer and a human technician named Orla Beck, who turned out to speak better technical Kaelthari than most Kaelthari junior officers. Because she had apparently been listening to our communications intercepts and learning the language since hour 2 of the invasion. Beck was 19 years old. 3 found this out and did not say anything for almost 10 minutes. The soldiers came aboard looking like soldiers who had been captured and kept, not harmed, not humiliated, but housed and fed and treated with a flat functional decency that was somehow more unsettling than cruelty would have been. Because cruelty we had categories for. This we did not. One of the soldiers, a young field trooper named Kess, gave the initial debrief. She was calm, steady, professionally composed, exactly as her training demanded. But there was something behind her eyes that had not been there when she boarded the landing craft 48 hours ago, something that had been installed by her time on the surface. What did they do to you? Thriel asked during the debrief. Not with suspicion. Genuinely, trying to understand. Kess looked at her hands for a moment. They fed us, she said. Twice. Actual food, not ration packets. Someone cooked it. A pause. They had a medic check everyone for injuries. She fixed Trooper Yale's shoulder, the one he hurt during the LZ-2 engagement. She was very thorough about it. Another pause. They did not interrogate us. They asked once if we wanted to send a message to our families to say we were alive. They said they would transmit it on our behalf. She looked up. I did not know what to say to that. I told them no. I think I should have said yes. 3 looked at me. I looked at Thriel. Neither of us had anything useful to add. There was one thing, Kess said. She hesitated. This was not natural for Kess. Kess was direct, clean, a precise communicator. The hesitation cost her something. Tell me. Thriel said. The first night, Kess said, we were held in a building, a school I think, by the equipment and the furniture. And there was a human, not a soldier, a man, older, no uniform. He came in with the evening food and he sat down with us while we ate, and he did not try to talk to us because neither side had translation available at that point. He sat with us. She stopped. And, Thriel said, and when he left, he put his hand on Trooper Yale's head. She touched the top of her own head, demonstrating, just for a second, like he was, like it was. She stopped again. I looked it up when they gave us translation access. I asked a human what that gesture meant, in that context. She said it was something parents do, to their children, when they want to say that they are not alone. The debrief room was completely silent. He had no reason to do that. Kess said, we came to take his planet. We killed his people. He had absolutely no reason to do that, and he did it anyway. She looked at Thriel, then at me. Her voice was very even, very controlled. The voice of a professional keeping something under tight management. I want that in the record. I want that written down, that happened. It will be, I said. I promise. And it is. The survey data transfer took 3 days to organize, as Holt had predicted. The human team that handled it was 5 people, which struck me initially as impossibly small until I met them and understood that small had nothing to do with their actual capacity. There was Beck, the 19-year-old who had learned Kaelthari from intercepts. There was a man called Dov Sar, who was some kind of theoretical physicist, and who spent the first meeting looking at everything in our ship with the expression of a person who has been told that a thing exists but is only now, physically, understanding what that means. There was a woman named Priya Nath, who was formerly a translator but who, in practice, seemed to function as the team's entire diplomatic instinct, and whose ability to read the emotional temperature of a room full of aliens was, frankly, startling. There was an older soldier named General Fenwick, who said almost nothing in meetings but whose presence in the room shifted the dynamics in a way that reminded me of pale vor, that specific gravity of someone who has seen enough to know what actually matters. And there was Holt herself, who attended every session in person because she was apparently the kind of person who attended things in person. I worked with these 5 people for 3 days. I will tell you what I learned, not about the treaty negotiations which are documented elsewhere in exhaustive legal detail, but about the humans themselves, which is what I was there to learn. Dov Sar, on day 2, asked me about Kaelthari history. Not military history. History broadly. How long had we been a spacefaring civilization? What had we built? What had we lost along the way? He asked with a genuine, almost uncomfortable to witness curiosity, the way a person asks when they actually want to know, not when they are filling space in a conversation. I told him, more than I needed to, probably. 7 hours. He had questions for most of it. At the end he sat back and said, "You have never encountered a species you could not beat." "No," I said. "So you never had to think about what you would do if you found one?" He said. "No," I said. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, which I had started to notice was something humans did when they were holding a large thought and needed somewhere to put it temporarily. "That must be," he said carefully, "a very different kind of loneliness than we have." I did not have an immediate answer for that. I thought about it later in my quarters for a long time. I thought about 840 years of victories, 47 civilizations, all that certainty, moving from one conquest to the next, never encountering its limit, never having to stop and ask itself what it was, because what it was had always been enough. And then I thought about humans, 14,000 wars, against each other, always against each other, always learning from the enemy because the enemy was also human, always having to adapt because the thing across the field had the same brain, the same hands, the same capacity for strategy and surprise and cruelty, and apparently cooking a hot meal for captured enemies and letting an old man put his hand on a prisoner's head in a school gymnasium. They had never had certainty, not for a single generation. Every time they stopped fighting long enough to breathe, something new came over the horizon and the whole process started over. They had never had the luxury of being unbeatable. So instead they had built something else, something that could not be quantified in a survey report, something that Laura's models had no variable for. They had built the ability to keep going anyway. On the 4th day, General Fenwick asked to speak with me privately. This was unusual. Fenwick had been nearly silent for the entire negotiation process. I had begun to wonder if he was actually listening or simply maintaining a physical presence as a matter of protocol. But when he sat down across from me, alone, in the small observation room I had been using as a workspace, and folded his big scarred hands on the table, I understood that he had been listening to everything and processing all of it, and that what he was about to say had been carefully built during every hour of silence. "Varian," he said. He used my name without the title, the way Holt did, the way most of the humans did, in a manner that was not disrespectful but simply direct. "I want to ask you something that is not about the treaty." "Ask," I said. "When your fleet showed up," he said, "what did you think we were?" I considered how honest to be. Then I decided that after everything that had happened, dishonesty would be insulting to both of us. "We thought you were," I said, "a moderately aggressive pre-unified species with significant internal conflict, limited technological development, and no meaningful capacity to resist coordinated orbital and ground operations." I paused. "We thought you would fight briefly, take significant losses, recognize the futility, and surrender. We thought the hard part would be establishing administrative control after the surrender, not the surrender itself." Fenwick nodded slowly. He did not look offended. He looked like someone who had suspected exactly this and was simply confirming it. "And now," he said, "what do you think we are now?" I thought about Kess in the debrief room. Orla Beck and her self-taught Kaelthari, the fish processing platform with the welded rail guns, Dax Roran's transmission from inside our fallen perimeter, Ren Holt who did not gloat, the man in the school gymnasium. I thought about 14,000 wars and an old man's hand on a prisoner's head. I think, I said, that you are the most complicated species I have ever encountered, and I study species for a living. I folded my own hands on the table, mirroring him without intending to. You are simultaneously the most violent and the most kind. You have spent your entire history trying to destroy each other, and in the middle of that history you built art and medicine and you cook food for your enemies and you worry about whether your captured prisoners feel alone. I have no framework for that. I have no category that fits it. You are not one thing. Fenwick was quiet for a moment. No, he said, we are not. Then he said, the species you have conquered, 47, what happened to them? I told him. The administrative structures we installed, the resource extraction frameworks, the slow managed integration into the Empire's economic systems, the loss of independent governance, the slow erosion of what made each species specifically themselves, not through violence, but through the grinding weight of imperial incorporation. He listened to all of it. Then he said, you should go back and look at them. Why? I asked. Because he said, I think some of them might still be fighting. I opened my mouth to say that was impossible, that conquest protocols were comprehensive, that our administrative systems were designed precisely to prevent organized resistance, that 47 civilizations had been pacified by those protocols across 8 centuries without a single significant resurgence. Then I thought about what I now knew about resistance, about what I had watched on the surface below us for 4 days, about the gap between no active armed resistance detected and not fighting, and I closed my mouth. And I wrote it down. The formal treaty was signed on the 7th day. It was signed for the Kaelthari by Consul Azip, with Admiral Palevor and myself as witnesses. It was signed for humanity by Ren Holt, with Fenwick and Prianath as witnesses. Beck translated. She did it flawlessly, in real time, without notes. She was still 19 years old. When it was done, Azip and Holt stood across the table from each other, and there was a moment, a specific held moment, that felt like the kind of moment that only happens a few times in a species' entire history. The kind of moment that gets put on the cover of history books, if the species in question makes history books. Azip said, Admiral Holt, I want to tell you something formally, for the record. Holt said, I'm listening. We came here, Azip said, believing we understood what you were, we were wrong. And I want to state clearly and without qualification that the Kaelthari Empire underestimated the people of this planet in a way that was our failure and not your limitation. He paused. You defended your home with everything you had against an enemy you had never seen before and had no reason to be prepared for. You did it without hesitation, without breaking, and without losing the ability to be decent to your enemies in the middle of it. I have been fighting wars for 300 years. Another pause. I have never seen anything like it. Holt looked at him for a moment. Then she said, for the record, we were terrified. Azip tilted his head slightly. You did not appear terrified. No, Holt said. We did not. She picked up her copy of the treaty and held it with both hands. We were terrified and we fought anyway. That is, as far as I understand it, the only definition of courage that actually means anything. She looked at the treaty. Don't come back, she said, not as a threat, just as a fact. The same flat, certain factual delivery she had used on the hailing frequency on day 1. Not like this, not as conquerors. If you want to come back someday and talk, we will talk. We are genuinely curious about you. We are curious about everything. But if anyone from your empire ever shows up in this system again with a fleet and a survey report telling them we look like an easy win, I want you to do something for me. What? Azip asked. Tell them, Holt said. What actually happened here? We left the Sol system on the 9th day. 230 warships, the same fleet that had arrived. Fewer soldiers, a treaty folded into every command officer's personal record. And something else, something I carried in my log, and in something harder to name, something between my thorax and my primary cardiac organ that the Kaelthari language does not have a precise word for. I watched the blue-white planet shrink in the aft viewport as we cleared the system boundary. Fiel was standing next to me. He had been reassigned from communications monitoring after the rock incident, or the classic rock incident as it was now being called in the lower decks, but he had developed a habit of standing near me during significant moments, and I had stopped trying to prevent it. What are you thinking about? He asked. The 47, I said. He frowned. The species we conquered? Fenwick said some of them might still be fighting. I said, I have been thinking about it for 3 days. I cannot stop thinking about it. Phil looked at the viewport. At the planet, now small enough to cover with a hand. Do you think he was right? Phil asked. I thought about Kess and the man in the gymnasium. I thought about Beck learning a language from intercepts in 18 hours. I thought about Dax Roran transmitting from inside our fallen perimeter, calm as water, asking if we could keep going for a while. I thought about a fish processing platform with welded rail guns. I thought about a species that had never once in its entire existence figured out how to stay out of a fight. Yes, I said. What are we going to do about it? Phil asked. I thought about 47 worlds, about the slow grinding weight of administrative incorporation, about what pacified really meant versus what it looked like in the data, about 840 years of certainty meeting a Tuesday morning over a blue-white planet and cracking in a way that could not be uncracked. I do not know yet, I said, but I am writing all of this down. I held up my log, every single piece of it, and I am going to make sure that when I deliver this record to the Imperial Archive, I mark it at the highest possible classification level, which means the people who need to read it will read it, and the people who are comfortable in their certainty will be very uncomfortable. Phil was quiet for a moment. Then he started humming. I looked at him. What is that? I asked. Something I heard in the human broadcasts, he said. I do not know what it means, but it felt right for the moment. I listened to it for a few seconds. It was low, rhythmic, the kind of melody that carries weight. I did not know what the words were or if there were words, but I could feel in the structure of it the particular quality of a sound made by a species that has been afraid and kept going anyway, that has been beaten and come back, that has been at war for its entire history and has somehow impossibly stubbornly refused to stop being capable of kindness in the middle of it all. Keep humming, I said. He did. I watched the Sol system disappear behind us. I opened my log to a new entry. I wrote the date, the location, the standard headers. Then I stopped and thought for a moment. And then I wrote, to any Kaelthari officer who reads this record and is currently considering, for any reason, adding the third planet of the Sol system to a target list, do not. I am not going to explain the tactical situation in detail here because the full record does that. What I will tell you briefly, plainly, and with the full weight of having witnessed it personally, is this. The humans are not an obstacle. They are not a resource. They are not an empire, or a hive, or a collective, or any of the categories we use to understand the species we encounter. They are something we do not have a word for yet, something that has spent its entire existence learning, under pressure, with everything against it, how to survive something that should have ended it. And the most dangerous thing about them is not their weapons or their numbers or their tactics or their speed of adaptation, although all of those things are genuinely extraordinary. The most dangerous thing about the humans is that they do not fight to win. They fight because they have decided that the alternative is not acceptable, and there is no tactical response to that. There is no orbital position, no fleet size, no suppression protocol that addresses the fundamental fact of a species that has looked at impossible odds and decided every single time that the odds are not the most relevant variable in the equation. I stopped. I thought about Holt's voice in the dark, steady and factual. We were terrified and we fought anyway. I wrote one more line. Leave them alone. Let them grow. And if you ever get the chance, talk to them. Because I believe, based on everything I have seen, that of all the things in this galaxy worth knowing, they may be the most worth knowing of all. I closed the log. Phil was still humming. The stars stretched out ahead of us, vast and cold and ancient. And somewhere behind us on a blue-white planet that had almost been a Tuesday afternoon exercise, a species that had just repelled its first alien invasion was probably already doing exactly what they always did after a war, arguing about what to do next, building something, getting ready for whatever came after.